Yeah.
Welcome to the final installment of this first series on modern Orthodoxy and its history and tensions and challenges and opportunities. Tonight, I am going to speak a little bit about Kriyat HaTorah and the mitzvah of Kriyat HaTorah and think a little bit about practical applications. All right, so it's one thing to talk about modern Orthodoxy, and it's another to sort of think through how that applies to the things that we do in our daily life.
How you read the Torah? Well, we will.
Um,
Yeah.
yes. And one of the feelings that was coming up for me this week as I was
What?
preparing for this class
Hey,
was a little bit of anxiety. And I thought to myself, like I teach every week, what am I feeling so anxious about? And I think that it is not lost on me, and I hope not lost on you, but I want to say it sort of explicitly that if it were not for the rabbis and communities that Rav Hodi outlined in the history of modern Orthodoxy class, I would not be able to teach this class tonight. Right? I would probably be putting my kids to bed while my husband went to shul to daven Mariv, or I wouldn't have enough knowledge to be able to teach this class because I wouldn't have learned Torah and I wouldn't have done the work to be ordained. And so that's like a big feeling for me that I hold right now. And I share that not just for transparency's sake, but also to say, like, I think Torah that affects us in this way, Torah of inclusivity especially, sometimes brings up bigger feelings than Parsha classes do. And so maybe you feel happy and proud of what we've done so far, or maybe you feel sort of anxious about not doing enough. Maybe you feel inspired that like we've taken steps, but we still have a ways to go. However you think about it, I guess I welcome the emotion. I think that to study Torah like this without that emotion would be challenging. And the second sort of pre-introduction thing I want to say is that, right, one of the things that got me to this place was being able to learn Torah. When I first got engaged to Will, my father was ecstatic. He is a very proud girl dad, was a very proud girl dad, but he also yearned for a son, and Will was going to fill that role for him in the most beautiful of ways. And my father was very excited to get him what he called a chatan's shas. So when he got married to my mother's family got my father a set of Gemaras, a set of shas to learn Torah. I think you can't get a much more orthodox gift than that, right? The father of the bride gives the groom Gemaras to learn in their marriage. And my father decided he was going to buy, a few masechtot each year based on what Will was learning in school. And he brought the first Gemara to our house in Riverdale in our apartment. And inside, he had written a note that said something to the effect of, Will, I'm so excited to have you in our family. I bet you'll use your chasana shas more than I did because I was sort of intimidated by learning. I'm so happy to have
Rabbi.
a,
She's the rabbinic assistant.
Oh,
sorry. Um, that he
Right.
was excited to have a son-in-law who was going to learn Talmud at this high level. And he said, but I will only continue to buy you Masechtot if you share them with Yael, who loves to learn Gemara as much as you do. And he went on to say, I love watching you two learn together, all these beautiful things. And I thought, like, there's nothing more modern and more orthodox than that tension, right? Because my parents chose to send me to Maimonides school where I learned 7 hours of Gemara a week for 6 years. And if they had not done that, and if those schools didn't exist, right, I would not be the person that I am today. And I imagine that a lot of this story is true for a lot of you in one way or another. So that's all the permission to feel all the feelings, to think about how much this Torah affects our life on the day to day. Now, to open, my introduction is a very short story, if you will permit me to tell one more story. This is not the story of a woman, me or anyone else, but the story of a small child. It happens to be a small boy child named Nisim, but it could have been a small girl child. And before Will and I came to the Midwest, we lived in Philadelphia and we were part of the work of building a breakaway minyan into a shul. And so this breakaway minion rented a space that was like this long, narrow room where we just set up folding chairs, and our bima was like a folding table on bed risers. It was not nearly as sort of intentional and beautiful as our sanctuary at Skokie Valley, where you have to like climb up something and there are these heavy chairs, right? This was a much more ad hoc room. And I tell you that because to understand the story, you need to know that. One day we're sitting in shul, our Gabbai pillar, founder of the community, Matt, is reading Haftarah, and you hear the scraping noise of a folding chair being dragged across this wooden floor. And I happen to be sitting next to Nisim's mother, who all of a sudden is like frantically gesturing at her husband to like go scoop up Nisim because he's dragging a chair all the way the length of this long rectangle. But before his dad could get to the front of the room, Nisim pulled up his chair to the bima and he climbed up onto the chair and he sort of stood on his tippy toes and peered over to look at the Haftorah book, that big book that Matt was reading from. And I sort of held my breath for a second. This felt like really high stakes for me, right? Would Nisim feel like Torah was accessible, like he was welcomed into looking at the Torah, or would he be rushed out of the room and told like this is not for children? And Matt, wonderful man that he is, without skipping a pasuk or a word or a letter, slid the book into the center of the table and smiled at Nisim. And Nisim and Matt read the Haftarah together. And Yaela, his mom, let out this breath of relief, and I let out a breath of relief. And I tell that story to say I think Kriyat HaTorah for women is sometimes feels sort of charged from a sociological standpoint. But if we think about how, like, ingrained in each one of us is this desire, like this little boy showed us, to just look into the Torah, right? That we know that listening and seeing are not the same, and we know that participating and observing are not the same. And that if we treated everyone as we treated Nisim, right? If we acknowledged that desire of our neshamot to look into the Torah, I think our community would be all the richer for it. So that is the perspective from which I am coming as I share sources. And I welcome everyone. I'm going to share my screen to join in thinking about the Torah. Okay, here we go. Good. Right. Okay. I think it's nice and big, right, Tamar? Is that big enough?
Yes.
Okay. Wonderful. Okay. So page one, which is zoomed in tight here, is three sources on the obligation to read from the Torah, right? So as Rav Ari explained last week, right, mitzvot aseh shehazman grama, right, time-bound positive commandments, women are generally excluded from, with some notable exceptions. Torah reading is a mitzvah shehazman grama, right? But why? I want to dig deeper than that. Not just that it's a positive mitzvah that is sort of time-bound to specific days or specific times of day, but what are we trying to do when we read from the Torah? So the first source here are some psukim from Devarim that describe the idea of hakel. I'm not going to read every word on the page. We have a lot to cover in our short time. But if you jump to Pasuk Yud Bet, right? Hakel comes from this name of to gather. Hakel et ha'am, that Moshe should gather all the people together. Ha'anashim v'hanashim, right? The men and the women. Hataf v'gercha, the children and the converts in your community. Everyone comes together. L'ma'an yishma'u u'l'ma'an yilmdu. Right? So we come together to hear and to learn. And certainly Talmud Torah is one of the mitzvot that we connect to the mitzvah of Torah reading, one from which women are generally considered exempt. But Hakel is not a Torah learning mitzvah from which women are exempt, but are actually obligated, right? Everyone comes together to hear and to learn. V'yir'u et Hashem Elokechem v'shamru la'asot kol divrei haTorah hazot. And it's meant to inspire us, right? To revere Hashem and to observe all of his teaching, all of God's teaching. So Torah reading is about maybe I would say a desire for community, the power of coming together to hear God's words said aloud. And maybe even more explicitly than that, and not just a communal sort of coming together, but a direct interaction with the divine. Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik has a beautiful thought that he develops that Kriyat HaTorah in public is equal to the experience of Amidah Lifnei Hashchina b'Ma'amad Har Sinai. That when it is a reenactment of the experience of standing before the Shekhinah at Har Sinai. Another thing that every single person did together, right? We say all of our neshamot were at Ma'amad Har Sinai, and that this is not just about hearing the word of God, but having a as close to a panim al panim experience with God as we can possibly have, right? To experience the Shekhinah in some kind of really intimate moment, right? And in hearing the Torah reading, b'shamu hakriya tarich hatzibur letzayer b'nafsho ki'ilu achshav haTorah nitinat misinai. That we're supposed to imagine it, right? And I think it's easier on like Shavuos, right? Or whenever we read the Ten Commandments, or like last Shabbat when we read Az Yashir in Shul, right? That these are moments where it maybe feels a little bit more charged and powerful when we stand up. Some people stand for all of Torah reading, right? We need to feel the intensity of that moment in the Torah reading. And the last piece, which I would, of the puzzle, which I would bring here, is from the Gemara in Bava Kama. And here the Gemara is talking about just as we read last week in Shul, right, when Bnei Israel go out into the Midbar and there's no water to be found. And the Gemara says, Dorshei Reshumot Amru, Ein Mayim Ela Torah. The story about the wilderness is not about literally thirsting for water, as we might, in a hot desert, but about thirsting for Torah. And so just like the Jews couldn't travel more than 3 days in the desert without having water, we also believe that that when they went 3 days without Torah, they would become weary. Kevan shehalchu shloshet yamim below Torah nil'u. And so the people need to hear the words of Torah. We thirst for the words of Torah, not just sporadically, not once every 7 years, not just at Ma'amad Har Sinai, but we need it every 3 days to keep us going. And so the Gemara says this is the reason that we read Torah on Shabbat, Monday, and Thursday, so that we never go 3 days without hearing words of Torah. So I guess my argument here is that Torah reading is not just checking a box on like did the mitzvah of that morning, but is this really deep connection to coming together as community, to engaging with the divine, to thirsting for like a spiritual thirsting for words of Torah. And so this is really important. And we want everyone to be able to do this thing because in all of these principal examples, the people are all together and we don't distinguish between men and women or grown-ups and children or people who were born Jewish and people who converted. All of Bnei Israel, if you have this Jewish neshama, you thirst for Torah, you thirst for divine, you thirst for community. Okay, so that's the hashkafa. That's so nice, Rabbanit Yael, but who is really obligated to hear Torah reading, right? I think that might be the question. Right, we would expect that the Shulchan Aruch would say men are obligated, women are patur, right? As Rav Ari said, not asur, it's not forbidden, but they're not obligated to read Torah. However, the Shulchan Aruch, which is echoing the Masachet Gemara Megillah, I don't have the exact citation in front of me, 23a, I think is the daf. The Shulchan Aruch says, Hakol olin leminyan shiva, afilu isha v'katan sheyodea l'mi mevarchinan. Mevarchin. Everyone counts towards those 7 aliyot who are called up, even a woman and a child who knows who we bless, right? So you can't be totally sort of unaware of what's going on, but women are included in this mitzvah. And if only we just if I just cut the line there, I'd say like, okay, let's all daven and read Torah together and go home. But the Shulchan Aruch and the Gemara Masachet Megillah go on, aval. But Amru Chachamim Isha Lo Tikra B'Tzibur Mipnei Kavod HaTzibur. So Rav Ari mentioned this briefly last week. That he was talking, I think, more about the experience of a woman leading benching for her family in her house, right? And that brings like a curse onto the house, right? And he said the halacha it doesn't say there's this one halachic opinion and a second halachic opinion. It says this is the halacha, but there is this other thing at play, this other fear of a curse in the house, or this other fear that in some way it is dishonoring to the community to have a woman be called to the Torah. And so it's hard to unpack how much weight we have to give this idea of kavod hatzibur, because the Shulchan Aruch does not say, and therefore it's asur, or therefore we should just not do it. He says, and therefore there is this other concern. Okay, so that's step one. It seems like on the surface, even if a woman is not chayevet, she's certainly allowed to be engaged, but there is this tricky kavod hatzibur issue that's going to bump up against her ability to do this. The other thing to consider is that Kriyat HaTorah is not a mitzvah on an individual person. Meaning, if you go to shul and you watch everyone shake lulav and etrog, but you don't, you have not fulfilled the mitzvah of lulav and etrog. But if you go to shul and 7 other men get aliyot to the Torah and not you, you have still fulfilled the mitzvah of Kriyat HaTorah, because it's a mitzvah on, right, al kol hamitz palalim, on everyone who is there to listen, but it is not a chiyuv yachid, but a chiyuv of the tzibur, right? This is a congregational obligation. And so this comes up most practically, right? You might say, well, who cares if it's a communal obligation or a personal obligation? In the springtime, sometimes Yantif in Galut in America or elsewhere outside of the land of Israel ends on a Shabbat, which means that in Galut we read the Yom Tov Kriyat HaTorah, but in Israel there are only 7 days of Yantif, and on the 8th day they read the next week's Parsha because there's nothing else to read. It's not Yantif for them anymore. And so you are off a week, right? There's sort of like a discrepancy here. And so if you live in Israel and you come to America or vice versa, right? Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is saying you don't need to find a Torah scroll and read to yourself the parsha that you've missed or the parsha that you've gone ahead to, because the obligation is communal in nature, and therefore there's no right. It's a chovat hatzibur, and therefore there's no obligation on each person. So that means that you would think that there might be some more room for women, right? Because we're not worried about each woman having the same chiyuv as a man. We're worried about this communal nature and obligation. Okay. One more piece, 2 more pieces to this puzzle. The first is the Magen Avraham writing in the 1600s in Poland. Here he says it is understood from the Masechet Megillah that we saw, right? The Isha chayevet lishmoa kriyat haTorah, that a woman is obligated to hear kriyat haTorah, even though, right, afal pi shenitz kaneh mishum Talmud Torah, even though maybe the mitzvah came about from the obligation to learn Torah, which we do not say women are obligated in. In any case, the Magen Avraham says this is actually more like Hakel than it is like Talmud Torah, and women are obligated in Hakel. And so women should be obligated. And he cites for us Masechet Sofrim, chapter 18, Perek Yud Chet, where it says, Katuv Hanashim Chayavot Lishmoa Kriyat Sefer. There it's talking about Megillah, but that women are obligated to hear the reading of the book, Ke Anashim, like men are, Umitzvah L'Targem, right? There's an assumption that women had a different level of knowledge back then, and maybe they didn't understand the Torah reading. There were definitely not books in the same way that there are today, and not with translations the same way there are today. And so the Magen Avraham says not only should women hear Torah reading, but we should make it accessible to them. We should translate it for them so that they understand. But Vikan nahagu hanashim latzeit chutza. But he says, but actually the women here are accustomed to going outside. And I think that what we are running into here is almost like the opposite of what we are experiencing today as modern Orthodox Jews. And this is what I mean by that. Today, we look at the reality and we say, women would like to be more involved here, or men would like to be more involved here. How can we help bring the halacha to that place, right? How can we understand the halacha in a way that allows us the space to do these things? Here, the Magen Avraham is saying the halacha is there. The halacha is saying women should do this, but the social reality in his time is that women weren't doing it. And I think it's very difficult. We see for the poskim, it's very difficult to say that the halacha is something that the community is not doing. This is not just with examples with women, but with all different kinds of people. And so it seems like the Magen Avraham feels a little bit stuck. On the one hand, he wants to say women are obligated to be here because it's like Hakel, and we should translate for them and we should make it accessible for them. And on the other hand, he's saying, but listen, like, I don't know what to tell you, the women aren't here. Maybe it's because they come late to shul. Maybe it's because they come to shul, but since they didn't understand Torah reading, they go outside to set up kiddush. Maybe it's because someone's kids get, schleppy in shul and they have to take them out for Torah reading. We don't know why the women didn't go, but we know that the Magen Avraham is stuck facing that reality. But it seems pretty clear to him. And, part of that, I think, the Aruch HaShulchan, coming about 200 years after the Magen Avraham, says, listen, Hakel is once every 7 years. Sure, we can demand that women show up once every 7 years to listen to Torah reading, but every Shabbos is impossible. No woman can come to shul every Shabbos and listen to the Torah reading, the Aruch HaShulchan says, right? That just was not a part of his lived reality. And so I think that you see the sources, the commentaries, the poskim struggling to match the reality to the halacha. Rav Yitzchak Yaakov Fuchs, I bring him. He is not a modern Orthodox Jew. He wrote a sefer called Halichos Bas Yisrael, in which he says he cites Hagaon Rav Yosef Shalom El Yashiv, who says that it is highly recommended that women remain in shul and listen to Kriyat HaTorah. And in fact, he goes so far as to say that a woman who comes late to shul should only daven during Kriyat HaTorah if she's davening the Shemona Esrei. She shouldn't come and start Psukei de Zimra and Torah reading. Torah reading is more important than catching up on your davening, with the exception perhaps of Shemona Esrei, because a woman might be more chayav in Shemona Esrei than in Kriyat HaTorah. But I think that obviously there are many more sources, and this is a selection that I think has integrity and also is building in my direction. But it's again, the Magen Avraham is not a feminist, right? I think that there does feel like there is something more than just patur going on here. And I do think it's driven by all of the values that we see on page 1, that we want women to be a part of this really formation building experience. Okay, so how do we get there? Rav Ari mentioned Derechecha as a good resource. It is an amazingly rich resource of sources. I wish that they were a little bit, they pushed a little harder on their conclusions, right? They have many beautiful source sheets, of which I have borrowed a lot for this shiur. But their answer is so what should we do? Well, we should add more light to the women's side. We should get rid of the balconies and bring women where they can see Hagbah, where they can better hear Torah reading. And I think that's important. Right? If you are a woman who wants to be in the main shul, 100%, the acoustics and the visuals should be such that you can hear the Torah reading. There should be enough chumashim on the women's side, right? All of that is true. And I will say, speaking only for myself and not with any agenda for the shul, right? As promised, this is learning Torah for its own sake. For me, that's not enough. I don't want to be, right? As I said, hearing is not the same as seeing. Observing is not the same as participating. And so there are two mechanisms that I want us to look at briefly that are ways to bring a woman into the experience of Kriyat HaTorah. One of them is women's tefillah. In Skokie Valley, we have two different iterations of this: the Skokie Valley Women's Tefillah Group and the relatively new experience of women who are families who would like to have their daughters batei mitzvah in the main sanctuary during mincha, where we have women's tefillah. And both of those are one way of thinking about how to bring women to the Torah, and we'll explore that. And the other is the concept of partnership minyan. Partnership minyan is like the experience in Kol Sason, which meets in our basement, which is an Orthodox oriented space that follows halacha in an Orthodox way, where women can't lead things that are Dvarim Shebekadusha, things that generally require a minyan, with the exception of Torah reading, because the issue of Torah reading is not a halachic one, but a kavod hatzibur one. And so women can participate in that way there. So just a brief history of these movements before we jump in. The first women's tefillah group happened in 1971. It was an outlier. It happened at Lincoln Square Synagogue in Manhattan on Simchat Torah. And over the next 10 years, groups popped up in Baltimore and St. Paul, Minnesota, in Riverdale, Washington Heights, New York. In the 1980s, the first tefillah group happened in Canada. There were about 20 groups that started. Skokie Women's Tefillah is one of them. They have a very beautiful and rich history in this community. They began as a group of members at Or Torah, learning with the rabbi there, and for reasons that are definitely far before my time, in the end, Or Torah did not want to host them, and they met in people's basements and living rooms. And then Rabbi Keller at Skokie Valley took them, allowed them to come into the Beit Midrash and to daven there. In the 1990s, there were over 40 groups with 4,000 women participating in the United States, in Canada, Israel, England, and Australia. By 2000, there were 33 groups in the United States, 22 of which were in New York, and 57 groups worldwide. And so this year, I counted on the JOFA website. I'm happy to send out the link to the JOFA website. I think there are 96 women's tefillah groups in North America. Israel, England, and Australia. While this is happening, while the Women's Tefillah Group movement has become more robust, in 2002, the first two partnership minyanim launched at the same time, Shira Chadasha in Jerusalem and Darchei Noam in New York. And now there are over 80 partnership minyanim around the world. So this is not like taking the Orthodox world by storm, right? It's first of all, it's like mostly coastal in America, not all over Europe, only in little pockets, mostly in New York, even in coastal communities, and there are more of them, and there are more people getting involved in Torah because of them. Okay, so let's look at women's tefillah first. So women's tefillah, and I would say both of them, but certainly more women's tefillah, I think you can trace back to this sifra. And this sifra is talking about a new ritual that is created in the time of the Beit HaMikdash. There is this idea of somchut, that you leaned upon the korban, and the women were generally not obligated or even allowed to do that. But two rabbis are talking, and Amar Rabbi Yossi, Amar li Abba Elazar. Rabbi Yossi says, Abba Elazar said to me, Haya lanu egel zivchei shlamim. We had an offering, right? A calf that we were offering as a zevach shlamim. V'hotzanuhu le'ezrat hanashim. And we brought it to the women's courtyard. V'samchu alav hanashim. And the women did smichut on this animal. And he clarifies, Lo mipnei shasmicha benashim. It's not actually an obligation for women to do smichut. Ela mipnei nachat ruach shel nashim. Rather, because of what is translated here as women's gratification. Nachat ruach, it made the women feel good, right? The women wanted to do it. It made them feel good. There was no reason not to let the women do it. And so we let them do it. And I think that in a lot of really beautiful ways, women's tefillah follows this model. Women wanted to be able to see in the Torah. I will say, even in Skokie Valley, Rav Ari has this beautiful tradition to allow children to see inside the Torah. On Erev Simchat Torah, we have a children's hakafa, and then Rav Ari opens the Torah, and each child comes up, and Rav Ari shows them a letter in their name. And one of the mothers said to me, wow, I've never seen in a Sefer Torah before. It's so cool, so different, right? She is my age. She has children that are under bar and bat mitzvah. She went to Ida Crown, and it was just never available to her, right? And it was so cool, right? It gave her some nachat ruach to be able to look in the Torah. And so I think that that's part of it. So women's tefillah groups, I think they are aimed at this experience, right? Of as Rivka Haut, who is one of the founders of Women of the Wall, who's a fairly contemporary, she passed away a few years ago. She says, right, that dedicated women have created a halachically viable option for Orthodox women who want to draw nearer, to come closer, to experience communal prayer from the center and not the sidelines. Right? So it doesn't have to be a mitzvah. It doesn't have to be that we're chayav. It's just this ability to draw near, to come close. Rabbi Aryeh and Rabbi Dov Frimer wrote, I think in 1988, this article, Women's Prayer Services Theory and Practice. It has become the sort of guide of women's tefillah groups. The Skokie Women's Tefillah Group uses the same halacha that they used when they consulted Rabbi Aryeh Frimer when they started. And they write in their article, in our extensive discussions with participants in such services, we have found a significant percentage report the experience enriching, moving, and edifying despite the halachic limitations. So we'll look at what those limitations are, right? But it seems that these are really valuable outlets for women to be close to Torah. Okay. Now, I apologize. I did something a little bit sloppy here in service of not having a very long source sheet. Rav Moshe Feinstein, right? Preeminent halachic decider, I think as Rav Ari said last week, not a modern Orthodox person, wrote the beginning until the second ellipses. And then I sort of shmushed him and his son-in-law, Rabbi Mordechai Tendler, together. They are spread out between a few pages, between pages 32 and 34 of the article, which I can also post in the group. This is what Rav Moshe says. He says, indeed, all women are permitted to perform even those commandments which the Torah did not obligate them to do, and they have fulfilled the mitzvah and received reward for the performance of these commandments, right? So to take it out of Torah reading, if a woman wants to bench lulav and etrog on Yantif, she is not chayevet, but she's also not, it's not asur to her. She's certainly welcome to do that, and she can say the bracha, right? In the Ashkenazi community, Sephardim have a slightly different idea, and many Sephardi communities don't have women say these brachot if it's considered a bracha levatala. But Rav Moshe is saying, if you want to do the thing, you can do it, and you can say the bracha on it, even if you are not chayevet. The ellipses covers what I would say is like a general question, questioning the motives of women. And this is why I told a story about children at the beginning, because I don't think we question the motives of children. Children are pure, grown-ups are more complicated. And there is a sort of open question in the more centrist Orthodox community. Are women doing this because they really want to draw closer, because they really find this enriching, or is this some kind of other thing? I find that to be distasteful, so I put some ellipses there. Right? And so nevertheless, he says, right, maybe that's true, but it is obvious that this is only so if her soul desires to fulfill mitzvot, even though she's not commanded to do so. And so in his opinion, and Rabbi Tendler's opinion, only theoretically speaking, can one say that if there exists a group of pious women whose considerations are solely for the sake of heaven and not without questioning of God's Torah and Jewish custom, why should we prevent them from praying together? It's such a powerful line. Why should we prevent them from praying together, right? And I believe this to be true of women's tefillah groups writ large. Maybe there is one woman in every tefillah group who is like sticking it to the man. Generally, I think you only bother to learn how to lay in a whole parsha if you really want to be closer to the Torah. And Rav Moshe and his son-in-law, speaking sort of in his name, say, why should we prevent them from praying together? They may also read from the Torah. So, although I would not say Rav Moshe was like an advocate for women's tefillah, he doesn't see a problem with it. So that is where we are. Now, I brought us Rav Hershel Schachter to bring up sort of, Rav Hershel Schachter was one of 5 Roshei Yeshiva at YU who wrote sort of a refutation of women's tefillah groups in this time, like the 1980s, 1990s. And they had 6 reasons, some of which are more offensive than others. I think Rabbi Schachter's is a really good point, the first one. And that is hamitzvot hein shelo bishlomotan, right? That they're not considered complete in women's tefillah groups, right? If you require a minyan to read from the Torah, and women can't constitute a minyan, then when you do a women's tefillah group, you're doing something important. You're learning Torah and you're engaging with the Torah, but you are not fulfilling the mitzvah of Kriyat HaTorah. But Rabbi Schachter says, were they to come to shul and hear Birkat HaTorah with the Baruch Hu, Hakiyum Hazeh, the fulfillment would be in hand. And it is my biggest grappling with women's tefillah is this. Right? That when it comes down to it at the end of the day, just like smichut on the korban, this is a simulation. It's a really important, really beautiful, really spiritual simulation, but we are not thinking that women fulfill the mitzvah in the same complete way that they would if they went into the shul. And I think that that is a challenge that should be acknowledged. Um, and we'll come back to it a little bit at the very end. We are running out of time. Okay. I'm not going to go over the other five examples. I think some of them, objections, some of them are better than others. The one that I will just mention sort of uh, out of sources is that Rabbi Schachter was concerned that like this is not a Jewish tradition. Women don't daven together like this. And the rabbis from say that actually this is one of the oldest Jewish traditions. And they point to something that happened in last week's parsha. Does anyone know what it is? What is the first women's tefillah group as it is? Read in Parshat Beshalach, the story of Miriam dancing with the women on the other side of the Yam Suf. I think it's a beautiful way that Rabbi Firmer sort of recontextualizes this for us, right? We sometimes are told that things that have modern value are not rooted in our tradition. I think Rabbi Firmer beautifully articulates that this is not an example of that. This is a modern tradition. This is a modern desire, right? Women feeling empowered to be able to do this, and yet it roots itself in Kriyat Yam Suf. Okay, we're going to look very, very briefly at the partnership minyan model. So this question of kavod hatzibor, right? I would say sort of off the page here, the issue is, right, is kavod hatzibor something eternal? It's a value. It's just eternally would be disgraceful to a congregation to have women read Torah. Or is it contextual in its time, and is it something that can be waived? Right. So I'm not going to read these inside, but as Chana Lakshenbab says, right, in a world where women can do anything in the secular world, is it truly disgraceful to a community to have a woman read Torah for them? Or would it perhaps be even more disgraceful for a woman not to be able to read Torah? And Rabbi Daniel Sperber, a Torah hero of mine, a halachic hero of mine, wrote a beautiful article called Congregational Dignity and Human Dignity, where he argues that this idea of kavod habriot might be able to sort of neutralize kavod hatzibor. And so this is a very brief taste of kavod habriot, where the rabbis are nidche. They allow their honor to be pushed off in the case of something embarrassing. I think the best example is this third one, which is that if you are only wearing one shirt or garment, and you a part of your tzitzit break off, and so you might be considered carrying in the karmelit. So this is a rabbinic mitzvah, and so you might think you have to just take off your shirt and leave it on the side of the road. The rabbis say no, we're nidcha. We waive our honor because we want the person not to have to go home naked, right? Undressed on the top. His our worry about his own kavod supersedes the kavod of the community or the rabbi's rules. And part of the way that Rabbi Sperber does this is by looking at the Maharam of Rothenburg and the Ran, right? So I say that to point out Rabbi Sperber is a frum guy, and he is a very learned man. And he's not just saying, listen, I think kavod habriot is not as important as kavod hatzibor. He's saying if kavod habriot, if kavod hatzibor was an absolute prohibition, then you could never have, a badi eved situation where the rabbis said it was okay. And the Maharam and the Ran both have sort of these badi eved situations. If there's no man who knows how to read Torah, if they know whatever, that then a woman can read. And so he says, based on that learning and based on this concept of kavod habriot, I think that we can weave this reading. And I will share this story that a colleague of mine, Rabbi Tali Adler, sometimes tells a story where she says her parents were immigrants to this country, and they would say to her when she was little, Tali, you know what's beautiful about living in America is you, as a woman, could be anything you want to be. You could be a doctor or a lawyer or the president of the United States. And Tali thought about it and she said, I would like to be a rabbi. And they're like, Tali, anything but that. You can't be that. right? And how do we hold that tension of saying a woman could be, right, president of the United States, education minister, even the prime minister in Israel, and yet it's considered kavod hatzibur to pretend she has, no ability to be able to do these things. Now, I brought the source here. I got a little bit of pushback about it on Shabbat, and it's fair pushback. This is a strong source, but I bring him because Rabbi Yehuda Herzl Henkin is a feminist and a Torah giant who stood up to further women's learning and women's leadership in the world. He is the founder of Nishmat, which has ordained over 150, not ordained, which has graduated over 150 women to be Yoetzet Halacha and yes, and Torah. Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Mel. And Torah scholars. The program is in Israel, but Yoetzet. I can't. Yoetzet Halacha in America as well. So he is willing to push the boundaries in a lot of ways. Rabbi Mendel Shapiro wrote his article right before Rabbi Sperber. I need you to stop taking pictures. Can you go take pictures of me? He says that he doesn't disagree with the halachic points, right? So it's sort of like the Shulchan Aruch. A woman could be called to the Torah. There's no one is arguing with that halacha. However, what he says is that a congregation that institutes women's aliyot is not Orthodox in name and will not remain Orthodox in practice. It's a feeling, right? He feels as though that is sort of outside the boundaries, even though, and I think there's sort of almost an irony to it because so many modern Orthodox rabbis could say Rabbi Henkin, no shul that has a Yoetzet Halacha could be within the boundaries of Orthodoxy, right? No shul, no day school where women teach Gemara could be within the boundaries of Orthodoxy. And I think that we see how these progressions are slow and painful and difficult. Right? When I was a child, no woman taught Gemara at Maimonides, right? There was not even a possibility of that. And now there are women who teach Gemara. And I would imagine that many people would have said, I could never imagine a time that that would happen. I will say I'm very grateful to this community because I know that I'm sure that there was a time in the not so distant past where someone would have said a woman could never be on the spiritual leadership team at Skokie Valley, right? It's simply outside the bounds of what we do and what we allow. And so I think that this is such a moving target. And when we say things like this, it comes, I think, from a place that is not really intellectually honest. And again, Rabbi Henkin cannot dispute the halacha necessarily. He's only saying it doesn't fit my gut check. We do not have a partnership minion there is a partnership minion that meets at Skokie, but Skokie Valley has a women's tefillah practice. And so that is the sort of practical halacha that I wanted us to look at very briefly in maybe 3 minutes or less. And that is, what brachot does a woman say when she approaches the Torah in a women's tefillah context? Meaning not in a partnership minion, not with a minion, but with a group of other women. So to understand that, just briefly, to understand the brachot of Torah reading, the Baruch Hu seems to stem from this very early Torah reading that's described in Sefer Nehemiah about Ezra. And the Baruch Hu is all about praising God and about appreciating God's glory in some kind of responsive way. Then there are 2 other mitzvot, and if you are looking at the short sheet, there's an addendum with them on there. The opening bracha and the closing bracha of Torah reading can either be thought of as birkot ha-mitzvah, right? Just like when you put on your tefillin, you say the bracha asher kichanu mitzvah b'tzivanu. It's not formulated that way, interestingly, for Torah reading, but maybe that's what it is. We're saying this is a mitzvah that we're fulfilling, or it could be thought of as a birkot ha-shevach, right? A bracha of praise, that we're praising God for giving us the Torah, for allowing us to have that spiritual thirst to be sated by Torah reading, for hearing God's words, for feeling that divine interaction. The implication being that it would probably be easier for women to say birkot ha-shevach, but of course, even Rav Moshe, right, allows women to say birkot mitzvah if they're doing the mitzvah. So questionable if you're doing the mitzvah in private, but possible. Last little piece of this puzzle is Masechet Sofrim is talking about a private Torah reading. If someone gets up by themselves and wants to read as an individual, he says brachot very similar to the brachot that we say today at the beginning and at the end of his Torah reading. Okay. Last thing, sorry, Rabbi Shlomo Goren, late Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel, he has a super interesting idea. This is the most liberal way you could think about this. He says, listen, if you're making a simulation of Torah reading, simulate it all the way. Say Baruch Hu, say all the brachot when you come to the Torah, because if the idea is to enact this mitzvah, you should say the mitzvah all the way. The other end, of course, would be to say no anything because of ziyuf Torah, not wanting. That's right. That's the YU Rashi Yeshiva's worry, is we don't want to give any perception that we think this is Torah reading. We shouldn't call women up to the Torah. We shouldn't allow them to say brachot of any kind, right? Because this is just about women learning Torah together. We're not actually doing this mitzvah. So the three options, I'm not going to go through all of the details right now. So with very few exceptions, some shuls follow Rabbi Goren's psak. He tried to sort of pull it back later in life and say Baruch Hu, but I would say almost all women's tefillah groups do not say Baruch Hu because it's sort of universally decided you need a minyan to do that. But with the first and last bracha, there are different ways to think about how you could be allowed to say them. The first bracha is in fact, and if you look in the addendum, is in fact the same as the third bracha of these Shacharit preparatory prayer Torah brachot. And so there is a question that perhaps women could sort of skip these brachot while they're davening in the morning, and then either say the first two quietly or say the first two during davening and say the third one upon reaching the Torah, meaning there's no bracha levatala because you would have said these anyways an hour earlier. The difficulty here is, of course, you don't always know if you're going to get an aliyah and shul. How do you know whether to skip them or not? Some people don't like the breaking up of the unit of brachot, right? So if you're only saying the third one when you're called up to the Torah, it's not a perfect solution, but it is an option, is to say, just skip it. Wait until you get to Torah reading. And based on the Masechet Sofrim, there is an idea that it would be allowed to say this last bracha. So Rav Avi Weiss in Riverdale, the head of Yeshivat Chavei Torah, founder and of Yeshivat Maharat, where Rav Ari and Rav Hodi and I all went to school, and Rabbi Saul Berman, all believe that you could do both the first and the last bracha. There are others. I apologize, I should have put in the word Dov Linzer everywhere that it says Linzer, not to be confused with the local Rabbi Linzer. Rabbi Dov Linzer, who is the current Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Chavei Torah, is uncomfortable with the brachot. And suggests saying the pasuk Baruch Ata Hashem Lamdini Chukacha. This is what Rabbi Frimmer suggests. It is what the Skokie Women's Tefillah group does. It's a pasuk. It's part of Tehillim, but it sounds like a bracha, and it is related to like the idea of learning Torah and following Hashem's ways. Some of the language of Hakel, right? And so there is sort of a feeling that this is like in the spirit of what one might say. And so the choices, right, are to maybe say the first bracha, but not the last bracha, right? Because the first bracha you might have said earlier in the morning anyway. Maybe to say both, or to just say a pasuk at the beginning. But in any of those ways, there is sort of an idea that being called to the Torah, right? Hearing your name being called to the Torah is important. In the women's mincha space, we say the first bracha and we say the pasuk at the end, which is sort of like a middle road situation.
Let me take it.
So sorry, I'm almost done.
Pictures.
I asked her to say mommy said. Okay. Okay, I want to wrap up. I know that this has gone long, and I would love to give people time to ask questions or share thoughts. I guess what I want to end with is to say, I think there's a lot of room. You could say with a lot of integrity within the halachic sources that there are. Meet please give him what he needs. I think there is a lot of room within the halachic. I'm so sorry. Just give me one. Okay. there is a lot of space in the halachic system within the context of Orthodoxy in a serious way to engage in the more modern experience of women who have risen to high levels of Torah learning and fluency in Hebrew and the ability to read Torah, to give them space to have that access that I would argue every Jewish neshama feels towards wanting to experience that Kriyat HaTorah experience. And at the same time, to balance that very carefully and to move at the sort of appropriate pace to make sure that it feels like we're doing it with integrity. And I have one more thing to say, but I've lost it in the drama of my living room. And I am glad that at Skokie Valley we have women's tefillah. I will say I'm glad at Skokie Valley that within the realm of Kriyat Torah B'tzibur in the main shul, women say some of the say the Mishaberachs, giving a space for women's voices and women's engagement in the space of Kriyat Torah. I'm glad that we have the women's tefillah group that meets under our roof, and that many of our members are very actively involved, and that gives women an opportunity to read Torah in that way. I'm glad that we have started offering the bat mitzvah experience where women can say some of the brachot of Kriyat HaTorah. And I'm glad that also that Kol Sason meets in our space, meaning I think that there is a wide range of community members in Skokie Valley. And I'm glad that we are providing opportunities at lots of different phases, and that we're willing to engage in this tension. And now I'm going to stop sharing so we can see each other's faces, and I would love to hear if anyone has any questions, thoughts, ideas.
Send those pictures me just
I'll say that was so outstanding. Thank you, Yael. There was so much to take in. Some of it I'm familiar with, some of it is new to me. So it's hard to digest it all in such a short time. There's a lot to think about here. But I'd like to say that when I was in graduate school in Baltimore, I was in the first Baltimore Women's Tefillah Group.
Wow.
And a famous woman who became a professor of Jewish studies. He was also in that group. And anyway, so I've been studying these issues for many years and exposing myself to different ideas. You have a lot of new quotes here that I'm not familiar with, so kol hakavod. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Judith, and thank you for sharing. Yeah,
You're
Myra, please.
Yeah, I sort of echo that. I mean, I was familiar with many of the sources because I've been looking at this stuff for probably over 40 years now. So I have to express some frustration with the glacial, or actually nowadays with melting, never mind, but the very slow progression of these sorts of things, and the whole Kvod Tzibur excuse to not allow progress, among other excuses. But I think you presented it all very, very clearly and very well. And I remain very frustrated.
I will share that in 1996, I had my bat mitzvah. It was a women's tefillah group in Newton, Massachusetts. And one of the girls in my class was not allowed to come. Her parents felt like it was usher and it was inappropriate that we were doing it. And I remember sitting on the sofa crying about it. And my mother said, "You should be very proud. You're doing something very new and different and special." And she said, "By the time you have daughters and they have bat mitzvahs, no one will even be talking about this anymore." And I reminded her of this when I was driving to Skokie on Friday, because I said it's like almost embarrassing to me that the source sheet could have been made practically in 1996 with few exceptions. And it's frustrating. And it's frustrating as the world simultaneously, I think, women's rights have exploded, and they're also being retaken away at a shocking speed at this moment in time. And so it feels pertinent, even though it feels like we should have put this issue to bed and sort of moved on by now at the same time. And I certainly struggle with that as well. Oh, Jean, yeah, please.
I actually was bat mitzvahed in an Orthodox synagogue in Pawtucket, Rhode Island in 1953. If you
Wow.
could imagine. There were 4 of us in the class. The 4 of us did it together. They never had one again,
Wow.
which I thought was very interesting.
Yeah. What a cool experience you had.
Yes, we read from the Haftorah, not the Torah. We sang a few songs. We did a kiddush. It was really, but it was very meaningful to us.
Just taking a picture of you.
It's interesting, right? Like what happened? You were 12, so you don't know, right? What happened that caused them to never do it again? What caused them to do it in the first place? What a fascinating story.
I have no idea. We then joined an Reformed congregation. I have no idea what happened.
Okay, well, thank you guys for coming and for learning. I believe there is a plan to do more learning around not the issue of gender, but issues of modern Orthodoxy in the future. If anyone has questions that sort of come up as you digest, please feel free to reach out. Thank you for going on the emotional journey of thinking about these things and engaging in this Torah. And I wish for us all to have many opportunities to experience that Shechina, that spiritual thirst, when we hear Kriyat HaTorah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you very much.